Stop thinking and follow me, cried Hitler. I will make you masters of the world.
A lot of people laughed. He was a clown, but they weren't so evil. It was a comedy.
America stands at the crossroads of its destiny.
In the early years of Hitler's rise, moviegoing had become an essential part of American culture. But Americans did not realize the extent of the threat Hitler posed.
He understood cinema could be put in the service of propaganda.
Americans realized we can't win this war. These guys are gonna beat us.
Western civilization was at stake, and we're going to fight until we win.
5 filmmakers wanted to respond as so many millions of men and women responded. They chose to serve.
These documentaries were powerful for American audiences.
The footage proved that the enormity of the task was worth it.
We had an enormous story to tell. The greatest heroes, the greatest villains on the world stage.
This was real filmmaking.
This is the people's war. It is our war.
These 5 men, they were saying goodbye to families who never knew if they would return.
And yet, coming out of it, each one made their greatest film.
I believe a film should have something to say. I think it should make people think and feel long after they've left the theater.
Nothing could prepare anyone for the intensity of the conflict.
These filmmakers changed the world.
I love this film, this series, for so many reasons. One, I love these filmmakers that you're talking about. I love the filmmakers that are talking about them. And I'm a film buff, and I just love watching the footage that you guys have compiled and put it together. And you've done a wonderful job doing it. Let's go back to the beginning, though. Mark, this started with your book.
Right.
How did you start writing this book? Where did you come up with this idea?
Well, my dad was a World War II veteran, and I realized that despite that, I had never paid much attention to his war stories or paid much attention to the war movies that these guys made. I just always thought of World War II as a time when they stopped making movies. So for me, it was just about, like, the minute I realize I'm avoiding something as a journalist, I've got to go run toward it. So I wanted to find out what they did in the war and how it changed them.
And what you found was that 5 of the greatest filmmakers Hollywood has ever had were actually overseas and making, well, Capra wasn't necessarily overseas, but like he was sort of running this mission of 4 different filmmakers who were out shooting films.
Right. These guys were the top directors in Hollywood, and they were given a special assignment, which was to go be documentarians and propagandists for the war, to like go all over the world wherever the war was and shoot it and turn it into films that the American public would see.
What's fascinating to me about the term propaganda and what they made is that you even see a moment in the film where the government itself is rethinking what the propaganda is and how good is propaganda, which seems very far-fetched considering where we are right now. Not to bring it to right now too much, but the idea that the government would be like, that's too propagandistic, let's pull it back a little bit.
Yeah, I was surprised in doing my research because I thought I'd find a lot of moments where the filmmakers were like, no, I want to tell the truth, and the government was like, no, you have to stick to our party line. And that really wasn't the case. I mean, when there were ethical lapses, they often came from the filmmakers themselves, and there were times when the government, even though it was for mixed reasons, would actually push Hollywood or the filmmakers to be, you know, more enlightened, more progressive in their treatment of minorities, for example. So I don't think the propaganda mission was ultimately what anybody expected it to be.
Now let's talk about the filmmakers that you've gathered to talk about these filmmakers. Each one sort of lends their voice to a specific voice. How did these filmmakers choose the directors that they wanted to tell the story of?
Well, they were all very knowledgeable of all 5 guys. So it was kind of a discussion that we had with them, like which one would you prefer, and
who got first dibs? Spielberg?
Yes, he was the producer. So, but you know the thing about those guys, we were not trying to match them up to, those guys like, oh, let's find a contemporary William Wyler or a contemporary Capra.
I think many people, even though Capra was a conservative Republican, many people would argue that Spielberg is kind of the contemporary Capra in terms of the emotions that he evokes in his films and the individualism that comes from the stories that he tells. But he chooses William Wyler, who's a far more comedic director.
Yeah, well, I don't know
Or
about
not necessarily comedic.
but,
Yeah, excuse me.
But the thing about the guys, who wanted them to have at least sensibilities that could be found in those guys. So Steven Spielberg, when I first met him, started working with him over 20 years ago. I remember being really moved by how generous, kind, and open he was, despite his
most successful filmmaker of all time.
Worldwide, exactly. And that's why he chose Wyler, because he said, I met him when I was just starting, and Wyler was just so generous and so kind, and I was surprised that somebody that big, was able to talk to me like a normal person, and I think that echoes.
Yeah, I mean, also, Wyler is the only Jewish director of the original five, so the war mission was very important to him on a personal level. His family was still in Europe, and Steven identified with that a lot, with that aspect of Wyler's struggle.
And actually, Guillermo identified with Capra because he's an immigrant.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I never saw that coming.
No, me neither. But he brought such pathos to the interview. It was actually very moving. His knowledge, the fact that he identified so much with Capra, and even when you make a horror movie, and we're just talking about Cronenberg backstage, I think it's all about emotion. It's all about characters. It's all about. And I think Guillermo is a real visionary, and his movies are extremely moving, despite the fact that they are perceived, as horror films or fantasy. Coppola, I really wanted, because I remember as a kid living in France, Apocalypse Now was coming out, and it was such an event. And he had been at the Cannes Film Festival and had done a very famous now press conference where he said, making Apocalypse Now was like my war. And it was like, the famous photo of him with a gun to his head on the set.
Heart of Darkness.
His Heart of Darkness. And I'm like, he is like John Huston, that kind of feisty, kind of guy. Paul Greengrass was a documentary filmmaker himself and really related to John Ford, and that was also very interesting for him to comment on his own experience and to say, I knew how Ford felt when he was filming Midway and put his camera on an elevated platform, which is the last place you want to be when there's going to be an airstrike. Lastly, Larry Kasdan, who I've known for years, I've talked movies with him, like we just, talk movies. And I wanted a guy who was also known for screenwriting and famous dialogue, and there's no one more iconic than Larry. And of course, after his great screenplays, went on to direct some iconic films. So all of those guys really had a very interesting sensibility and identity that I think is reflected in the five, past directors as well.
Were these directors that you also looked to when you were doing your research? Did you talk to them about these directors, or was this a new development for the film?
No, this was a completely new development for the film. When I worked on the book, one thing I realized very early on was there's no one who was in a meaningful position during World War II who was still alive and able to be interviewed. So rather than talk to family members who were, would have to rely on their memories as very little children in some cases, or on the stories they've been told, I did all of my research in archives.
Which we see a lot of in the film. We see unbelievable footage that these men shot. I want to go back to Coppola and his coverage of John Huston. And one of the things that Coppola says, and he's referring to Apocalypse Now, is that it's almost impossible to make an anti-war film. Once you get your camera in there and you start shooting battle, fictional or not, it feels heroic in some way. It feels courageous. I think this is something that even Spielberg probably struggled with when it came to Saving Private Ryan, an incredibly brutal film that in many ways feels heroic and patriotic in the end and is celebrated for those reasons. How did you struggle with that as storytellers in this film?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's Huston himself, who filmed one of the most famous battle documentaries, San Pietro, told the military, if I ever make a pro-war movie, I hope you take me out and shoot me. And certainly, we didn't set out to make a movie about the glory of combat or war. I think this film is much more about the cost of war. But at the same time, you're seeing some incredibly exciting and vivid footage of a conflict that literally could not have been larger. It was on the entire world stage. So, I think we're both aware that that's a really complicated conflict, that war is horrifying and also exciting, that it's something you want to turn away from, and yet it's also really visual.
Yeah, war is cinematic. And I think we've seen it through the examples that you just mentioned with Saving Private Ryan, but also Platoon and Apocalypse Now, and it's a real dichotomy, I think.
Well, I would say at the risk of, I don't want to say that your film is not exciting. It's exciting to watch, but I say you do an incredible job of using this footage in a way that doesn't feel like you're gratuitously showing the excitement of war. Most of it feels battle-hardened and somewhat scary. And did that come mainly from the footage? Was it actually hard to find footage that looked exciting and courageous?
I think it came from the experience of the original 5 directors. I mean, some of them went into the war thinking, oh, this is going to be a big adventure. This is going to be a chance for me to test my courage. Huston, I think, of all of them, thought it was going to be fun. And what they encountered was...
Of course Huston thought that.
Right. I mean, everything was a big game to him. But what they encountered was terror. Huston found it really frightening to be at war. Capra was sick at heart when he was in London during the Blitz. John Ford saw an entire squadron of men get wiped out in a single battle, 30 young men that he had filmed just the day before. So we wanted to be true to their experience, which is that the war they saw and the war that their cameras captured was not fun.
And to your point, actually, the challenge was this epic story, epic canvas, but a very singular point of view of 5 guys, and their own personal experiences, So I think that was the balance that we were constantly kind of struggling with. Like, we're telling this World War II story, but it needs to stay very focused on those guys' experiences. So that sort of guided the choices that we made with footage, to constantly speak for the world stage, but okay, how can we incorporate Pearl Harbor in our story? And that was during the making of Mrs. Miniver that Pearl Harbor happened. So suddenly we found a really great personal way of Wyler's own story and how Pearl Harbor affected the making of his film, as opposed to just, Pearl Harbor happened,
What did you take away from the element of, and maybe I'm actually this is a leading question, the element of white supremacy that goes into the way Germans were depicted in propaganda films and the way Japanese were depicted in propaganda films?
Race was a really big issue and one that we wanted to explore in this documentary. I mean, the Germans were depicted as human beings under the thumb of a ruthless dictator and who had kind of gotten hypnotized by him. But the Japanese in American documentaries and in Hollywood movies at the time were literally referred to as rats and dogs and monkeys. They were treated as another species. And this was a big issue in the war. The film that Capra made called Know Your Enemy Japan was so horribly anti-Japanese that it was suppressed. General MacArthur, after Hiroshima, said, I really don't think American soldiers should see this, and I don't think the American public should see it. And
do you think that has to do with the fact that Japanese initiated war with us, whereas with Germany we were kind of going in, for all
yes.
purposes to, save the people versus sort of defending ourselves?
I think that was a big thing. It's easy.
It was racist too. Excuse me. Yeah.
Right, but no, both things can be true. But it's easy to forget now that for the first year of America's involvement in the war, it was a war in the Pacific, and it was a war against the people who had attacked us on our home turf. And that was not an experience that we'd ever had with Germany. There was constant fear, especially in the first year the war that there were sleeper cells of Nazis living in America, in your hometown, in your city. And you see that in a lot of entertainment movies of the period, like The Nazi Next Door, I Married a Nazi, that kind of thinking. But
movie titles?
I Married a Nazi is a movie title, yes. And it's exactly what you would imagine a movie called I Married a Nazi would be.
I like The Nazi Next Door. I
think I might have made that one up.
Well, let's write that movie. That sounds great to me. At Pupil 2 or something.
Right, exactly.
I'm curious what your thoughts are when it comes to the sort of ubiquitousness of images now versus then. Shooting film at this time and the way that it played for the movie-going public. It played on massive screens. It played before they were going to see big feature films where they stayed in theaters all day. And it had a different impact versus when we go to war now and the way that images are collected now, it's much easier. They're much more ubiquitous. And, you know, to quote a song that I was listening today, each new act of war is tonight's entertainment, you know? All of the major networks can show different kinds of acts of war all the time, and the government is very good at clamping down on certain images as well.
I think it's one of the hardest things to convey about 75 years ago, this idea that if you wanted to see the war, you had to leave your house and go to a movie theater and experience it on a big screen collectively with your friends and family and neighbors. There's, you know, and you had to wait. I mean, after D-Day, theaters would advertise outside, you know, 10 days until first D-Day footage, 9 days until first D-Day footage. Now, the next war, and you know, I hope it's not anytime soon, but the next war you're going to watch on your phone, and you're going to watch it almost in real time, as we all do. So
you're reading conspiracy theorist comments about it while you're watching it, and
right, people saying what you're watching isn't real. I mean, that will absolutely be a part of it, which was not the case during the Second World War.
And I hope actually the documentary really reflects the fact that when George Stevens enters the camp, there is no vocabulary of the Holocaust at that point, and so the horror was really interesting for us to try to capture that moment of inserting black images in between each of the scenes, as if closing your eyes, looking, and reopening them, trying to avoid looking at things, you know. Now, of course, we know that event and what happened, but back then nobody knew. So, and
as we're seeing, though, it's incredibly important that we remind people of that event.
You know, and I think Steven talks for that, actually, to understand the present is to look back in the past, you know. But the thing that's interesting about George Stevens at that point, he had turned from, you know, narrative filmmaker into documentary filmmaker, and now he becomes an evidence gatherer. And those images are used at the Nuremberg trials, you know. So it's a pretty powerful segment in the film, and talks to your point, actually.
When it comes to the Holocaust and the footage that Stevens collected, where were you in the editing process of this when just last month or 2 months ago, you know, the White House basically wouldn't recognize the Holocaust on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and then there was just a recent incident where the Anne Frank Center got involved and was like, you're being completely offensive to victims and survivors of the Holocaust. What was it like to be in the midst of making this when we're in the midst of a administration who will not recognize it?
I mean, we're actually done with the film when all of this was coming up, but it just made it even more important to us to say, you know, we're making something really important, or we've made something important. In fact, with Mark, we had hoped at some point that this would come out before the elections, and now I think we're glad it's coming out after, maybe, or
yeah, I mean, I think we're shocked. You know, we didn't expect this documentary to come out into this world with issues like this. I mean, of all the ways I thought the story might be resonant for today, Holocaust denial from the White House, you know, was not one of them, and you know, it underscores why it was so important that Stevens went into the camps and shot that film. You know, all you have to do is go on Twitter for an hour and you'll meet plenty of people who say the Holocaust never happened, it was an exaggeration. Imagine how many more of those people there would be if cameras hadn't gone in there, at least, and documented what we can all see now.
Well, there are some camps that cameras didn't get into, and they were some of the most horrific camps, and because of that, people use that as bullshit evidence to try to prove that the Holocaust was an exaggeration. Yeah.
And you know, I have a kind of a unique perspective on this whole thing because I grew up in Europe, I grew up in France, and I remember in high school, you know, I went to a Catholic school, but they showed us, Night and Fog, which was a movie about the Holocaust, half hour, where you saw all those images. I was very young, maybe like 12 years old, and everybody wanted, because there was so much anti-Semitism going on in the school. My best friend was Jewish, even though again it was a Catholic school, and we were bullied. Me because I was his friend, and him because he was Jewish, and it's unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about the 70s, it's crazy.
Night and Fog, they showed that to you in high school?
Yes, Alain
Pretty
René.
unbelievable. That's like a very artsy depiction of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
an American public high school. I don't think they know that. Let's open up to the audience for questions. Who has a, right here?
Hi guys, thanks for being here. I'm actually really excited to see this. I'm really super interested in the whole topic, but I'm curious, since this is for Netflix, I'm just curious as to, have you seen any of the documentaries that they've premiered already, and are there any that kind of struck your interest?
Netflix documentaries? Oh, yeah. I mean, I've seen a ton of them. We saw a couple at the Oscars this year. They made an amazing short film called White Helmets. The producer of our movie, the co-producer John Batsek, made an extraordinary movie you can see on Netflix called Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom.
He just made another documentary called Cries from Syria.
Right, Cries from Syria. I was a huge fan of Making a Murderer, like a lot of people. I mean, that's also a Netflix documentary. Chef's Table, you don't think of that as a documentary, but it is a documentary series, and it's really a series of beautiful one-hour movies. So we were thrilled to work with Netflix. They do a really interesting variety of documentaries. They also acquired a huge amount of stuff at Sundance this year. So some of the things you read about in the Sundance documentary competition, you'll see over the next year on Netflix.
Yeah, and Winter on Fire is actually the same editor, and that was on the base of that film that I hired him.
Incredibly well compiled, put together film.
Yeah,
edited.
yeah, and it was based on that I hired him to do this.
That makes sense. He does an amazing job here. How long have you guys been working on this, and when did Netflix get involved?
We've been working on it for about 3 years. We started talking about it when the book was published in early 2014. Netflix got involved about a year later, but when this was still in its very early stages. So they've basically been in on it pretty much all the way.
Next question, right here, or right there, and then you, sir.
Hey, I was wondering, do you know if World War II was the only time when the U.S. government brought on directors to create films or like propaganda or whatever, or were there other wars before or after that too?
Well, it was definitely the first time because, it was the first war that we participated in when there were sound films and when the film industry had grown up enough so that the government had to take notice of it. There was never, in subsequent wars, a time when the U.S. repeated this kind of program, although if you think about the recent wars that we've been in, the practice of embedding journalists, of granting them special access by having them travel with a platoon, that's not an official propaganda mission, but in a way it's access journalism. It's saying if we bring you in, we're going to bring you in on the chance that the access we give you will mean you'll be more likely to tell our story our way. So, but no, the program was never repeated. Certainly not for Vietnam on the scale of World War II.
Certainly not for Vietnam.
No.
They did not want filmmakers going in there and telling the story.
They really didn't.
Yeah.
Although there's an interesting cameo appearance by Coppola filming the war in his film Apocalypse Now. Anyways, interesting little.
Right here?
Yes. To what extent was Goebbels aware of the work of these directors and the effects it was having at home in the United States? And the second part of my question would be surrounding post-production. Could you describe how they posted everything and whether Hollywood was involved with it or was it done in the field?
Sure. Well, Goebbels was very aware. I mean, he was sort of the chief propagandist for Germany, but he was also very aware of what Americans were doing. He he saw Mrs. Miniver in particular, William Wyler's movie, and said sort of disappointedly that he thought it was a brilliant piece of propaganda for the Allies.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but weren't Americans also extremely aware of what Goebbels was doing and had seen Triumph of the Will and were also in some way responding to
the American
that?
filmmakers were. I mean, Capra got the whole idea for the Why We Fight films by seeing Triumph of the Will, which is the famous Leni Riefenstahl German movie about the might of Hitler and the new Reich, and got from that the idea to use German propaganda in American propaganda to show young fighting men what the enemy could be. And your question about the post-production, you mean their post-production or our post-production? Oh, their post-production. One thing about it is it was really fast. I mean, the imperative was to get these movies up and in front of people as soon as possible, whether it was in front of soldiers or in front of civilian audiences. And often the directors we're talking about had to kind of hide their footage to make sure that the army didn't cannibalize it for newsreels, because these took a little longer to make than newsreels. But the mission was like, get it done, get it up in front of people fast. I mean, the Battle of Midway was in June of 1942, and a few weeks later, John Ford's documentary about it was in theaters, and it eventually played in 3/4 of all of the theaters in the United States.
And they were shooting it and then sent it back to Capra, right? Who would view the reels and have editors compile it, right? They weren't editing it overseas.
They weren't editing it overseas. In some cases, it would be sent back to Capra. That's how the D-Day footage was done. He and his team compiled it. John Ford was in the Navy, not the Army, so he was kind of on his own and did his own thing.
In hiding.
In hiding, yes.
Guys, I love the film so much. Everybody go watch it. It comes out on Netflix this Friday. It's also at IFC Center in New York and LA. And when you're done watching it, if you've never seen a film by any of these filmmakers, I go watch some. There are some incredible work. Go watch at least John Huston's Fat City, because that's my favorite movie. Guys, thank you.
Steven Spielberg also has done a few good movies also. No.
I don't know who that is, to be honest with you. Guys, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks very much.